I am a 56-year-old man, born and raised in a quiet Midwest town where the wind carries the smell of cut grass in the summer and burning leaves in the fall. A place where people still slow down to wave even if they don't remember your name. The kind of town where folks age with the seasons slowly, naturally, sometimes painfully, but always with a sense that home means safety. For most of my life, I believed that too. I believed that if you worked hard, stayed humble, and treated people right, life would eventually treat you right in return. But beliefs have a stubborn way of shattering exactly when you lean on them the most. And on the day my daughter told me to eat in the garage, mine did not just shatter, they turned to dust. People think betrayal arrives with noise, with doors slamming, voices raised, plates breaking. But I learned that real betrayal comes quietly, dressed in the voice of someone you've loved since the day they opened their eyes for the first time. When her words crossed the room and landed on me, "Dad, you look messy, just eat in the garage, please." It felt like someone reached inside my chest and squeezed something I didn't even know could hurt that much. The moment she said it, everything inside me paused. My hands froze halfway toward the dining chair. My breath felt trapped somewhere between my ribs. And for a moment, I didn't know if I should sit, stand, leave, argue, or simply disappear. There's a silence that follows certain kinds of pain. A thick, heavy silence that wraps around you like wet cloth, making every movement feel slow and every breath feel forced. That silence filled my daughter's dining room. It settled on the furniture, on the polished floor, on the plate in my hand. It even settled on her face, a face I used to wipe clean when she spilled juice. A face I kissed goodnight for years. A face that once couldn't sleep unless I told her everything would be okay. But the face looking at me now was different. Not angry, not cruel, just uncomfortable, embarrassed, as if my being there was a problem. She needed to hide quickly before someone else noticed, and that, God, that cut deeper than the words themselves. I had come to help her. That's all. I had spent hours working in her backyard under the sun until sweat soaked through my shirt. I fixed her broken gate because she kept forgetting to call someone. I trimmed her hedges because she said she didn't have time. I cleaned her garage because she had guests coming and wanted the place to look nice. I didn't ask for anything. Not water. Not thanks. Not even a break. I'm from a generation where men worked until the job was done, not until they felt tired. So I pushed through. I did everything she needed, and by the time I finally stepped inside, hunger twisting through my stomach, shirt sticking to my back, my only thought was that a warm meal and a moment to sit down would be nice. But apparently, the way I looked, the sweat on my forehead, the dust on my clothes, the dirt under my nails was too much for the image she wanted to keep. She pointed toward the garage like it was the obvious solution. Like it was completely normal to send your father there to eat alone because he didn't match the picture you wanted others to see. And the worst part, her pleas, not gentle, not loving, just the kind of pleas people use when they're trying to move something out of the way without making a scene. I waited for her to laugh, or smile, or shake her head and say she didn't mean it. But she didn't. She just stood there, hands on her hips, eyes shifting away from me like she couldn't bear to look at me for more than a second. Then the front door opened. A cheerful, middle-aged woman stepped inside with the kind of smile you give when you're entering a warm, welcoming home. She held a plate covered with foil and started talking before she even looked up. But when her eyes landed on my standing there with my plate. Caught between the table and the garage door, her smile died instantly. Her eyebrows pulled tight. Her whole face changed in a heartbeat. She glanced at me, then at my daughter, then back at me. And beneath her breath, soft but sharp, she muttered something that sounded like, "Are you serious?" I didn't know if she said it to me or to my daughter, but my daughter reacted like the words slapped her across the face. She straightened her back. Her jaw tightened. She looked suddenly small, suddenly guilty, suddenly aware that someone had caught her treating her own father like he didn't belong. The neighbor didn't hide her disappointment. She stared at my daughter with an expression that said far more than any lecture could, and for the first time, I saw my daughter's confident mask crack. She looked ashamed, nervous, like she was praying I wouldn't say anything, like she wanted time to rewind itself and erase what she had done. But time doesn't go backwards. I just stood there, and in that moment I felt every year of my life weighing on me, every sacrifice. Every day I worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, every midnight drive to pick her up when she called crying, every promise I ever made that she wasn't alone. I looked at her and I wondered how a bond built over decades could feel so fragile in a single second. How a child you raised could one day treat you worse than a stranger would. And then the neighbor opened her mouth and said something I wasn't expecting. Something that would twist everything I thought I knew about my daughter. I didn't know that woman well. Just a few waves, a few hellos. But on that day, her courage became the spark that lit the truth on fire. Her words were the first thread unraveling a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and secrets I never knew existed. Words that would expose why my daughter had changed so much. Words that would push me into a fight I didn't even realize I had been avoiding for years. But that part of the story comes later, because before the truth came the decision. And on that afternoon, standing in a house I once believed would always feel like home, I picked up my plate, turned toward the garage, and walked like a man carrying the weight of 1,000 disappointments. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't demand respect. I simply told myself one thing as the door creaked open, and the smell of dust and gasoline filled the air. This was not the end, not even close, because sometimes the people you love break you quietly, and sometimes life sends someone you barely know to show you the truth you refuse to see, and this painful, humiliating, unforgettable moment was only the beginning of how everything fell apart, and how, for the first time in a long, long time, I finally stood up for myself. The morning before everything collapsed, the morning before the words "eat in the garage" tore through the small, fragile bridge between me and my daughter, I woke up with the kind of uneasiness that doesn't have a clear shape or reason. It was still dark when my eyes opened. The house wrapped in that pre-sunrise quiet where every sound feels louder than it should be. My bones ached the way they always do, a low, familiar ache that comes from years of lifting, bending, working, surviving. But that morning, there was something else, something in the air, a heaviness that sat on my shoulders as I sat at the edge of the bed, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. A heaviness that whispered, "Today won't be like other days." I moved through my small kitchen the way I had for decades, slow but steady, with practiced motions that come from routine rather than thought. The kettle hissed, the old wooden chair creaked beneath me, and the coffee tasted slightly stronger than usual. Not bitter, not burnt, just strong enough to catch my attention. I stared out the window at the faint outline of the neighborhood, Still asleep, the streetlights glowing like tired guardians. The silence felt thick, almost too still, like the calm you get right before a storm rolls in. Even though the forecast had promised sunshine all day, my eyes drifted to the calendar hanging on the wall. A cheap dollar store calendar with faded mountain pictures. My daughter had circled today's date a week ago. She said she was hosting a small gathering. Nothing fancy, just a few friends, and had asked me to come early to help get the place ready. She knew I would say yes. She always knew. I don't think it ever crossed her mind that I might be tired or busy or simply wanting a day to myself. Maybe because I never said no. Maybe because after her mother died, I tried so hard to be enough for both of us that I forgot to set any boundaries. I became the man who showed up every time she needed something, and over time, maybe she forgot that showing up was a choice, not an obligation. I finished my coffee, washed the mug, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The sky was beginning to lighten, streaked with soft blues and pale golds. I drove through streets I had known my whole life, passing houses where I had fixed fences, repaired roofs, or shoveled snow without being asked. That's the kind of man I've always been. A helper, a giver, a steady hand. I thought being that way for my daughter meant she would never feel alone. I didn't realize it could also mean she might take me for granted. When I pulled into her neighborhood, something tightened in my stomach. Her area was one of those newly developed communities where every house looked like a glossy magazine cover, square edges, tall windows, trimmed lawns, and driveways without a single crack. It was clean in a way that felt unnatural, like everything was maintained for appearance rather than comfort. Too perfect, too polished, too quiet. I parked by the curb and stepped out of my truck. That's when I saw him. A man I had never met before sat casually on her front porch, one ankle crossed over the other, sipping from a mug like he lived there. He looked young, too young, really. Early 30s, maybe. His shirt tucked in too neatly. His hair styled like he'd spent more time on it than I ever spent on mine in my entire life. He lifted his eyes when he heard my footsteps, and the smile he offered wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that people use when they're pretending to be polite but don't actually want to be. For a second, I thought maybe he was one of her guests arriving early, but then his eyes lingered on me just a little too long, and something in his expression told me I wasn't welcome. Not in that house. Not in that moment. Not in whatever new world my daughter had stepped into without telling me. I walked up the porch steps and nodded at him. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice steady. He barely nodded back. "She's inside," he muttered, before returning to his phone, dismissing me like I was a delivery man, dropping off a package instead of the father who raised the woman. He was now sitting outside waiting for a stranger, sitting comfortably in a space I used to help pay rent for when she was struggling. A man I did not know, but who somehow already felt like a wall between me and my daughter. Moments later, she opened the front door. I hadn't seen her in a couple of weeks, and when she stepped out, she gave me a hug, but not the kind she used to give me when she was younger. Not the warm, tight, genuine kind. This hug felt rushed, forced, like someone was watching and she didn't want the moment to last too long. Her arms barely stayed around me for a second before she pulled back. Her eyes flicked toward the man on the porch, and something in her softened when she looked at him, approval-seeking, nervous, trying to hard a look I recognized from years of raising her, look she used to give me when she wanted to make sure I wasn't upset. But now she was giving that look to him. "Dad, can you start with the backyard? It needs to look good today," she said, her voice professional and stiff. Like I was a worker she'd hired, not her father. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I wanted coffee. She didn't ask if I was tired. She just gave instructions and walked off. I told myself to shake it off. She was stressed, I thought. She was hosting. She had people coming. Maybe that man was her friend or coworker and she wanted to make a good impression. Parents are experts at making excuses for their children long after their children stop deserving them. So I headed around the back and got to work. The sun climbed higher and the heat sat heavy on my shoulders. Sweat soaked through my shirt. My hands stung from gripping the tools. My knees reminded me of every year I had lived. But I kept going. I trimmed hedges until the clippings formed piles. I pushed the mower until my arms felt like rubber. I swept the patio until the concrete looked new again. I fixed her loose gate hinge with the small toolkit I always kept in my truck. I reorganized her garage so neatly that even strangers would think someone had paid for a professional service. And every time I stepped inside for water, that man was there, sitting on the couch, standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, watching me, whispering to her, and her eyes those same eyes that once sparkled every time she saw me walk into a room shifted away from me each time he whispered, like she was ashamed of me, like she didn't want him to see me as someone important, like she didn't want anyone to know that the man fixing her backyard was her father. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that the man was just protective or insecure or unfamiliar with me. But deep down, I felt the crack forming. Slow, small, silent, like the way ice splits on a lake before anyone notices. Men like me, we don't explode. We don't break in front of people. We just carry everything until we can't anymore. By the time midday came, I was exhausted. Dust covered my arms. Sweat had soaked through my shirt twice over. My back felt tight, but I kept going. Because when you're a father, love isn't measured in comfort. It's measured in how much you're willing to give even when your body is begging you to stop. But love blinds even the strongest man. And there is a difference between being needed and being used. I didn't realize that line had already been crossed. I didn't see how far I had already stepped into a place where respect had started slipping away from me. And by the time the sun hit its peak, the ground beneath my feet had already shifted. I just didn't know it yet. By early afternoon, the air inside my daughter's house felt heavier than the summer humidity outside. It was the kind of heaviness that sits on your chest and slows your breathing. The kind that tells you something is wrong even if no one is brave enough to say it. I had lived through enough quiet conflicts in my life, bad neighbors, long work shifts, family disagreements to recognize when a storm was brewing. But this one felt different. This one felt personal, like the universe had decided to stack its cards against me and was waiting for me to finally notice. My daughter moved through the house, like she was being chased by invisible deadlines. She kept adjusting pillows that were already perfectly in place, straightening picture frames that were not crooked, wiping countertops that were already spotless. Her hands wouldn't stay still. They trembled slightly every time she lifted something, and she bit her lip the way she used to when she got caught lying as a kid. And yet, whenever I asked if she needed help or if something was bothering her, she forced a small smile and insisted she was fine. But her voice betrayed her. It cracked softly on the last word, like it was too fragile to carry the lie. I watched her move from room to room, her eyes darting to the man, the stranger, every few minutes. He wasn't sitting on the porch anymore. No, he had made himself comfortable inside. He paced her living room like he owned it, like the carpet belonged to him, like the air belonged to him, like she belonged to him. And every glance he sent my way carried something sharp enough to slice right through my skin. Not anger, not fear, just disdain. Cold, confident, dismissive disdain. The kind a man uses when he wants you to know you don't matter. I tried to brush it off, told myself he was just uncomfortable around new people. Or maybe he thought I was too old-fashioned, too rough around the edges for their polished modern lifestyle. But deep down, something crawled in my gut. A warning. A feeling I recognized from years ago, when I worked in factories where tension spread like wildfire and silence meant something dangerous was brewing. I tried again to check on her. I stepped closer and said softly, "You look stressed. Everything okay?" She didn't even turn her head. "I'm fine," she said quickly, almost sharply. Too sharp, too fast. And for the first time all day, I noticed something in her voice I didn't like. Fear or guilt, or maybe both. I opened my mouth to ask more, but she had already walked away, leaving me standing alone in a room that suddenly felt too small for all the questions in my head. A few minutes later, I walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. My throat felt dry, but not from the heat. It was the kind of dryness that comes from holding back words, from swallowing emotions too big to fit inside any man. That's when I heard it. A whisper, low but not low enough. The stranger was leaning toward my daughter, his hand resting casually on the counter, his voice smooth as he said, "You cannot let him sit with everyone. People will start assuming things." Assuming what? That was the question that snapped something inside me. That was the moment I stepped forward, my feet moving before my mind had the chance to stop them. "Assuming what?" I said firmly. The man lifted his eyes slowly, like he was annoyed I still existed. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes stayed cold, calculating, unimpressed. He looked at me like I was blocking the sunlight, like I was something he wished he could sweep out of the way. Before he could answer, my daughter spun around so fast she nearly knocked over a glass. She stepped between us, her hands raised slightly, her words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "Dad, please, don't make this harder, harder, harder than what?" The question echoed inside my skull, bouncing off walls that suddenly felt thinner than before. "What am I making harder?" I asked, my voice calm, but my heart pounding like I had just run a mile. She didn't look at me. She didn't even try. She stared at the floor, whispered something too soft to understand, and then turned away as if she had suddenly remembered some imaginary task that required her immediate attention. She left the room without answering. I stood there, staring at the doorway she had disappeared through, feeling a small crack forming inside me, the kind of crack that starts in your chest and spreads slowly, silently, until one day you realize everything you've built is about to collapse. Still, I turned around and walked back outside. Because that's what fathers do. They swallow their pain. They bury their questions. They hold on to the hope that things will make sense eventually. I pushed open the garage door and stepped inside. The place smelled like dust and old paint. Sunlight peeked through the small window, lighting the broom I had left leaning against the wall. I picked it up and kept sweeping, pushing dirt into neat piles. Clearing the floor, I didn't know I'd soon be told to sit on like a discarded guest. If someone had told me in that moment that I'd be eating alone in that same garage, later sit on an old plastic chair like an unwanted relative, I would have walked away and never looked back. I would have saved myself from the humiliation that was waiting for me. But love has a strange way of blinding a man. It makes you tolerate things you should never tolerate. It makes you hope when hope is the last thing you should be holding on to. Inside that house, something was already breaking, and everyone, my daughter, that man, even the walls themselves seemed to know it. Everyone except me. The storm wasn't just coming anymore, it was already here. The house was loud now, alive in a way that felt almost cruel. The floors vibrated with footsteps, the walls echoed with chatter, and the air filled with that fake sugary excitement people bring to celebrations. Everyone who walked in carried bright gift bags with tissue paper exploding out of the top, little balloons clipped to the handles, and those warm, polite smiles that people reserve for baby showers and birthdays and weddings. But none of those smiles were for me. I stood there, right in the middle of the hallway, visible, present, real, and yet somehow completely erased. Guests brushed past me shoulder to shoulder, one after another, murmuring greetings to my daughter, complimenting the decorations, laughing at some joke the young man cracked, but not even sparing me a glance. It wasn't accidental. You can feel it when you're being overlooked by chance, and you can feel it even more sharply when you're being ignored on purpose. This was the second kind. Every time someone walked by, every time a shoulder clipped mine without an apology, every time a stranger's eyes slid past my face as if looking at me might contaminate them, something inside me tightened. A small string at first, then a rope, then a wire pulled so tight it hummed under my skin. I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat, telling myself maybe people were distracted, maybe they didn't recognize me. Maybe they assumed I was a worker or a hired cleaner or someone's distant uncle who slipped in silently. But after the fifth person looked right over my head like I was part of the furniture, the truth finally stopped pretending to be polite. Someone had said something about me. Someone had painted a picture of me before I even showed up. So everyone walked in already knowing who I was, supposed to be not the father who raised her, not the man who worked 3 jobs to support her education, not the guy who spent the whole morning cleaning her home so her guests would be comfortable, but something else entirely, something unwelcome, something embarrassing, something better left unale, led GED. It felt like being demoted from a human, being to a ghost in my own daughter's life. For a moment, I stood near the kitchen doorway, hands hanging awkwardly at my sides, watching strangers celebrate my grandchild like they had more right to be there than I did. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep my chest from collapsing under the weight of humiliation building inside me. I kept telling myself, this is her party. Don't ruin it. Don't make a scene. Don't show them how much their silence hurts. But silence can be louder than yelling, and their silence was screaming at me. Finally, I walked toward my daughter, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to be the calm one, the reasonable one, the adult. She was adjusting some balloons near the dining table when she noticed me approaching. But instead of her expression softening, instead of her face lighting up with relief or gratitude, or even the bare minimum of "Oh hey Dad," her eyes narrowed. Her gaze traveled down to my shirt. The stains, the sweat, the proof that I had worked myself to exhaustion for her. She frowned like I had ruined her picture-perfect event just by standing there. "Dad," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "Maybe you should clean up. People will be uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. That word hit me harder than anything else that happened that day. Uncomfortable, like I was a problem. Like I was a stain. Like I was something she needed to hide. I stared at her, and in that moment, time didn't slow down, no. It froze, completely and brutally. I looked at my daughter, this woman I had raised with tenderness, with discipline, with sacrifice, and I realized she wasn't looking at her father. She was looking at an inconvenience. My hands that built her childhood bike. My arms that carried her when she cried. My legs that ran beside her on her first day of school. My back that bent for years to earn money she never had to beg for. All of that was standing right in front of her, soaked in sweat because of what I did for her. And all she could think about was how I looked in front of her guests. Not a thank you, not a dad. You did so much. Not even a sit down and rest. Just, people will be uncomfortable. Something inside me cracked. Quietly, without announcement. Like a small fracture you don't notice until the whole thing collapses later. The beginning of the end didn't come with shouting or slamming doors. It came with that one sentence, delivered casually, carelessly, like she was talking to a stranger who overstayed his welcome. I didn't argue with her. I didn't defend myself. I just stared, and for the first time in my life, I saw her not as my little girl, but as a woman who had learned to treat me as optional, as disposable, as someone whose presence needed to be managed so it didn't ruin her reputation. But even then, even with that pain pounding through my chest, the worst part of the day was still waiting for me like a dark cloud on the horizon. It was coming, and I could feel it. A moment so sharp, so gutting, so unforgivable that it would snap the wire inside me completely. And when it snapped, everything changed. I moved toward the dining table slowly, almost dragging my feet, not because I wanted food, but because I needed a moment to ground myself. The room around me felt too loud, too bright, too full of people who seemed to belong there more than I did. The dishes were laid out beautifully, steam rising from them, filling the whole house with warm, inviting smells. But even that smelled hollow to me. I picked up a plate, and the edges felt cold and thin between my fingers. My hands were trembling not from age, but from exhaustion, from humiliation, from something deeper that I couldn't yet name. I tried to steady myself, pressing my thumb against the rim of the plate, willing my grip to stop shaking. As I stood there, reaching for the serving spoon, I caught my daughter out of the corner of my eye. She wasn't looking at me the way a daughter looks at her father. She was scanning the room, scanning the faces, checking to see who was watching, checking to see if anyone noticed that the tired, sweaty old man in the corner was her blood. Her eyes moved quickly, nervously, like she was embarrassed to even be near me. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't worried about me eating. She was worried about people watching me eat. Then she walked up to me, fast but trying to look casual. She touched my elbow lightly, so lightly it felt like she didn't want her skin to fully touch mine. She leaned in close enough that I could feel her breath on my cheek. Her voice was soft but sharp, each word clean and deliberate, slicing through my mind before I could even react. "Dad, can you please go eat in the garage? You look messy. Please, just do it." And just like that, everything stopped. The voices around me turned into a distant hum. The clinking dishes, the laughter, the musical of it faded away, swallowed by the ringing in my ears. My vision blurred for a second, like my eyes were suddenly underwater. My throat tightened so sharply I couldn't swallow. My chest filled with something heavy and cold, like a stone had been dropped straight into my ribs. Eat in the garage. Eat alone. Eat when no one could see. Me. 50-6 years of living. 56 years of working with hands. That never stopped giving. 50-6 years of fatherhood. Sacrifice, devotion, protection. And this moment was what all of it added up to. I felt the plate in my hand become heavier, as if the food inside suddenly weighed the same as my entire life. I slowly lowered it back to the table, pressing it down because my fingers suddenly felt weak. My breath hitched in my chest, stuck somewhere between shock and heartbreak. I didn't want to cry, not here, not in front of these people, but something inside me cracked so violently. I felt the pieces shifting, the garage, like I was an embarrassment, like I was something to hide away, like junk. I opened my mouth to speak, maybe to ask her why, maybe to remind her who I was, maybe to beg her to look at me like her father just one more time, but no words came out. My tongue felt heavy. My voice felt locked behind a lifetime of pride that was now crumbling. And just when I thought the moment couldn't get any worse, when the humiliation felt complete, the front door swung open. A burst of cool air rushed inside. A new voice entered the room. A pair of footsteps approached. The neighbor walked in. She was a woman around my age, maybe a little younger, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail, wearing a casual shirt and jeans. She held a plate covered in foil, smiling like someone who came to share something warm, something kind. But the moment her eyes landed on me, on my lowered plate, on my daughter's stiff posture, on the terrible tension in the room, smile vanished instantly. She froze, her eyes widened. Then they narrowed. She saw everything in one glance. The embarrassment on my daughter's face, the exhaustion on mine, the shame hanging between us like thick fog. What's going on? She asked sharply. Her eyes darted from my daughter to me, then back again, and then she said the sentence that stopped the whole world. Why is he holding his food like that? And why does he look like he's about to eat outside? That was the moment the mask slid off my daughter's face. She opened her mouth, stuttering, trying to explain something that could never be explained, something that made no sense, something she should never have done in the first place. Her excuses tangled in her throat, coming out in nervous fragments. She looked guilty. She looked exposed. She looked like someone who suddenly realized other people were watching and judging. The neighbor's expression hardened. Her lips pressed together. She glanced at the guests, who had gone silent, watching the scene unfold. Then she slowly walked toward me, her steps deliberate, steady. When she reached me, she put her hand on my shoulder gently, like someone who knew what pain looked like, someone who understood humiliation the moment she saw it. Her voice softened, not pitying, but respectful, protective, almost motherly. "You deserve better," she whispered. Those 3 words hit me like a warm hand pressing onto a freezing wound. They didn't heal it, but they made the pain visible. And then she turned, full of fire, facing my daughter with a sternness that filled the entire room. "He is your father," she said, her voice steady and fierce. "What in the world are you doing?" You could hear a pin drop, and then the whispers started behind me, quiet at first, then louder, spreading across the guests like a ripple crashing through. Water. People were connecting the dots. People who didn't greet me. People who ignored me. People who assumed things because they were told lies. The man on the porch. The smug one finally stepped inside again, wearing that same strange smirk, like he enjoyed the tension, enjoyed watching this family crack open. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, as if he had been waiting for this kind of chaos. But the neighbor didn't back down. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't soften her tone. She wasn't going to let this moment pass like the others had. And that was the moment, the exact second, the story shifted. The match was lit. The fuse began to burn, and nothing after this would ever be the same. The neighbor didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone cut through the room like a blade slicing clean through fog. The chatter died instantly. The clinking glasses, the small talk, the forced laughter, all of it faded as every pair of eyes slowly shifted toward us. My daughter, who had been moving around all day like a shadow of herself, froze completely. Her back stiffened. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for support, for escape, for anything that could take her out of the moment she had created. The young man beside her, slick hair, polished shoes, ego shining brighter than his watch, stepped forward a little, as if he owned the house, the room, the situation. He wrapped one arm around her shoulder, staking a silent claim. And the neighbor saw it. She saw everything, more clearly than anyone else had all day. Then she asked the question that would change everything. Why is your father being treated like he's some outsider? Not yelled, not demanded. Simply spoken, like someone pointing out a truth the whole world had been pretending not to see. I felt my daughter flinch beside me. Just a twitch. A quick movement of her jaw tightening. A flicker of shame or fear, I couldn't tell which. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. She swallowed hard, and her eyes glossed over as if she was searching for the right sentence, the right excuse, the right lie. But before she could say a single syllable, the young man stepped in front of her. He didn't even let her breathe, didn't even let her find her voice. He practically pushed her behind him, like he was shielding her from her own guilt. It's complicated, he said smoothly, too smoothly. The kind of smoothness that smells like manipulation, like practiced lines, like rehearsed control. He makes people uncomfortable. Those 4 words slammed into my chest like a punch. He makes people uncomfortable. I stared at him, really stared. Not with anger yet, no. That would come later, but with disbelief. With the kind of disbelief only a man who has built his entire life around loyalty feels when someone steps on everything he's ever done. Me, making people uncomfortable. I, who had spent decades working jobs that broke my back just to make sure my daughter had new shoes for school, had money for college, had a safe place to sleep. Me, who stayed up nights when she had fevers, who learned to braid her hair after her mother died because I wanted her to feel cared for, who sacrificed everything just so she would never feel left out. And this stranger, this man who walked into her life months ago, thought he could define me in one sentence. I didn't say anything. The words stuck to my ribs like they were glued there. My jaw clenched. My fingers curled unconsciously, not out of aggression, but out of something deeper, betrayal, a kind of sadness that drained the strength from my bones. The neighbor turned slowly to him, and her stare was so sharp it made him shift his weight from one foot to the other. confidence draining, his shoulders pulling in. That was the first crack in his armor. Then she looked straight at my daughter. Her eyes softened slightly, but her tone didn't. Is that true? Or is that something he told you? The silence that followed was thick, heavy. It pressed on my chest like a weight. My daughter didn't move. Her breathing hitched. Her eyebrows pulled together just a little, the way they used to when she was caught lying about sneaking cookies at age 7. Except this wasn't a cookie. This was her father. Her blood. Her history. The room grew so quiet you could hear the ticking of the decorative clock on the wall. Tick-tock, tick, and then it happened. She didn't answer. She looked down. Her silence was louder than a confession. It was louder than if she had screamed yes. And the moment her eyes fell to the floor, something clicked inside me so clearly it felt like a switch being flipped. All the strange changes, all the cold replies, all the distance, all the awkward smiles, all the whispered conversations behind my back, the looks of embarrassment any time I walked in, all the times she avoided hugging me if he was in the room, all the times she seemed torn, nervous, hesitant. Someone had been twisting her thoughts slowly, gently, expertly. Not overnight, not suddenly, but drip by drip, whisper by whisper, moment by moment. Poison works that way, and the poison was standing right beside her, his hand still, gripping her shoulder, his jaw tight now, his eyes glaring at the neighbor, as if she had ruined something he worked hard to build. It all made sense. This wasn't just disrespect. This wasn't just her being rude. This wasn't just her being stressed or overwhelmed. This was influence, control, manipulation. A slow rewiring of her heart and mind. Over months, he had been turning her against me, bit by bit, until she saw me not as her father, but as a burden. The neighbor saw it too. She recognized the look in my daughter's eyes, the mixture of guilt and fear. You see, in someone who knows they've been pulled away from the truth, but doesn't know how to get back. And in that moment, the room changed. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances. Some looked at the young man with suspicion. Some whispered quietly among themselves. But everyone knew something real was unfolding now. Something that wasn't just awkward, it was ugly, wrong, intentional. My daughter looked like she was collapsing inward, like she didn't know whether to defend him or apologize to me. Her lips parted slightly. Her hands trembled. She was stuck between two worlds, the world I had built for her and the world he had pulled her into. And he tightened his grip on her shoulder as if he sensed she might slip, as if he didn't want her thinking for herself, as if he owned her. The neighbor stepped even closer, positioning herself between them and me like a shield. The truth wasn't fully out yet, but the surface had cracked. The air in that room wasn't just heavy anymore. It was suffocating, thick, unforgiving. Every person present, whether they were holding a plate, a drink, a napkin, or just their own breath, seemed frozen in place. No one dared move. No one dared break the tension. It was the kind of silence that forms right before a life-changing truth comes crashing down. The neighbor stepped forward, not aggressively, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of someone who refuses to let wrongness stand another second. Her shoes tapped lightly against the hardwood floor, a sound that echoed louder than footsteps should. My daughter's shoulders tightened. The young man straightened his spine, trying to look taller. The guests parted just enough to give the neighbor space, like they could sense she was about to pull something hidden into the light. She turned to me first, and when her eyes met mine, they softened with something rare: recognition, respect, understanding. Then her gaze slid toward my daughter, and her entire expression shifted, sharpening like a blade warming over a flame. "You know," she began softly, yet every word carried weight, "I've lived across from you long enough to notice patterns, and I've watched your father come here quiet, steady, dependable more times than I can count." My daughter lowered her head. Her fingers twisted together. Her breathing hitched. She looked like a child again caught, exposed, unable to run. The neighbor didn't stop. "I have seen him arrive before the sun," she continued. "I have seen him leave when the moon is already high. I've watched him paint your porch when the paint cans were bigger than my patience. I've watched him fix that broken gate twice. I've watched him mow your lawn while you stood there scrolling on your phone. And every single time I waved, he waved back." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. "That is not a man," the neighbor said firmly, "anyone should be ashamed of." My daughter's chin quivered. Her eyes glistened with tears. She tried to blink away. But these tears weren't from sadness. They were from the sudden realization that someone outside her bubble had seen everything she tried so hard to hide. Then the neighbor turned slowly, deliberately to the young man. "And you," she said, each word like a drop of cold water on hot steel. "Who exactly are you?" He straightened, forcing confidence into his posture. His face tightened into an arrogant mask. "I'm her partner," he replied, "and I'm trying to help her keep things peaceful. But he pointed at me like I was a stain on the carpet, makes it difficult sometimes." A few guests exchanged looks, not surprised looks, uncomfortable ones. The kind people share when the truth starts sounding uglier than they expected. The neighbor's mouth opened slightly, disbelief written across her face. She let out a soft, bitter laugh, not out of humor, but frustration. "Peaceful?" she asked, her tone dangerously calm. "You call this peaceful? Making her own father eat alone in the garage." Gasps slipped out from the edges of the crowd. A woman near the hallway covered her mouth. A man near the counter shifted uncomfortably, staring at the floor like the shame belonged to him too. The young man took a step forward. His voice rose, sharper this time, less controlled. "Look at him," he snapped. "He's dirty. He's sweaty. People will feel weird eating next to him." My daughter grabbed his arm, trying to silence him, but he shook her off. That was the moment the neighbor's patience snapped clean in half. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising, her shoulders squaring, and when she exhaled, her voice came out steady but lined with fury. "Let me tell you something," she said. "Where I come from, sweat is not something to hide. Sweat is respect. Sweat is sacrifice. Sweat is love. Sweat means someone has worked for you." The room fell so silent I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The neighbor's eyes locked onto the young man like she was peeling back the surface of who he pretended to be. "You stand there," she continued, clean and empty-handed, "acting like you're above him. But you're the one who should be ashamed, not him." My daughter's face crumpled. She covered her mouth with both hands. Whether it was guilt or panic or both, I still couldn't tell. But her shoulders began shaking. Her breathing quickened. The young man clenched his jaw so hard the muscles twitched. The smooth, confident expression he had worn all day began to crack. Fear slipped through. Anger followed right behind it. The neighbor took one more step forward. Close. Enough that she was practically standing between him and my daughter, close enough that he could no longer hide behind her. And then she asked the question that would rip the veil completely off their secret. What exactly have you been telling her about her father? The man froze. My daughter's breath stopped mid-chest. A few guests let out shocked whispers. Someone dropped a fork. A glass clinked so loudly it echoed, but no one said a word. Not him, not my daughter, not a single person in that room, because the truth wasn't just knocking at the door, was breaking it off its hinges. The man tried to speak first. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His throat tightened visibly. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, for someone to rescue him, for a lie that might still work. My daughter's eyes filled completely now, tears running down her cheeks, her expression a mix of shame, fear, confusion, and realization. Her silence told the whole truth. Something had been going on, something had been whispered, something had been planted in her life like a growing shadow, a shadow that had pushed me out. A shadow that had replaced my warmth with suspicion, a shadow that had convinced her that her father, was a burden. And the longer they stayed silent, the clearer the truth became. The neighbor took one small step back, giving them space to speak, to explain, to confess. But neither of them said anything. They didn't have to. The truth was already spilling out, slow and uncontrollable, like a crack spreading through glass. The room held its breath, because the dam had finally broken, and everything behind it was about to come flooding out. The moment those words left the neighbor's mouth, the whole room felt like it had tilted, like gravity itself was bending under the weight of the truth that was finally pushing its way to the surface. My daughter stood frozen, her hands trembling. Her breath caught halfway in her chest, as if she didn't know whether to inhale or run out of the room entirely. The young man beside her shifted his stance, the confident smirk he had earlier twisting into a forced, nervous half-smile that didn't match the fear flickering behind his eyes. Everyone watched him, everyone, and he knew it. The silence was so sharp that you could almost hear the sound of his throat tightening when I stepped forward. My footsteps weren't loud, but in that heavy silence, they felt like thunder. When I finally stopped in front of him, I wasn't angry, not yet. I was confused, hurt, exhausted from months of feeling like something was wrong but never being able to prove it. I looked him dead in the eye and asked him as quietly as I could, "Tell me, what have you been saying about me?" His lips parted, and for a moment I thought he was going to lie again. But maybe the pressure, the eyes, the truth creeping around him from every direction, maybe it cracked something in him. Because, instead of denying it, he spoke, and every word he said felt like another stone being dropped into my chest, pulling me deeper and deeper into a pain I did not expect to feel at my daughter's baby shower. "I just told her you needed guidance," he said, his voice shaky but trying to sound firm. "That you didn't know how to behave in social situations. That you could embarrass her in front of people she wanted to impress." My daughter's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide, her mouth open just a little, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing out loud. Her face was paler than I had ever seen it tanned. Her hands slowly slid down from her stomach, resting at her sides as if she wasn't sure what part of her life she was supposed to hold on to anymore. I felt something twist inside me, something old and soft and vulnerable. Embarrass her, me. I had spent my entire life trying to give her stability, comfort, love. All those years of waking up early, working late, saving every penny, caring for her mother when she was sick, raising her alone after life took a turn, all reduced to the idea that I was a source of embarrassment. He didn't stop there. No, he took a small breath and continued, as if he had already thrown one stone into the river and now he couldn't stop himself from throwing the rest. I told her that maybe you were struggling with aging, that maybe you were becoming too attached, that you were overstepping. That word, overstepping. It hit me harder than anything else. Helping her wasn't overstepping. Supporting her wasn't overstepping. Loving her wasn't overstepping. But somehow, through his words, through his influence, through whatever twisted narrative he had built, he made my daughter believe that my presence in her life was something suffocating instead of comforting. The neighbor let out a sharp, controlled breath, one that carried both frustration and sadness. She stared at him with a look that could slice steel. You twisted his love into a flaw. Why? And that's when he snapped. The calm, collected mask he had tried to hold on to broke, and the bitterness underneath spilled out. Because he is always here, always interfering, always trying to act like he knows what is best for her. She needs independence. That word again, independence. As if independence meant cutting off the only person who would drop everything for her at a moment's notice. As if independence meant destroying the bond between a parent and child just because it made him feel more in control. I stared at him, my voice low, steady, but filled with a pain I could barely keep buried. Independence, is that what you call cutting a father out of his own daughter's life? My daughter began to cry, not soft tears, not embarrassment, but a deep shaking kind of crying that came from the soul. Her shoulders trembled, her chest rising and falling too fast. And she looked at him the way a person looks at someone they thought they knew but now realizes they never understood at all. I didn't know who to believe, she whispered. You told me he was trying to control me, that he didn't trust my decisions, that he wanted me to depend on him forever. Hearing that felt like someone pressing a cold blade against my heart. I understood then why she had become distant, why she stopped calling, why her smiles felt forced whenever I visited. All this time, I thought maybe I had done something wrong. Maybe I had pushed too hard. Maybe I was being overprotective, but no. He had been poisoning her mind, drop by drop, day by day, until she couldn't see me clearly anymore, until she saw my love as something dangerous instead of something safe. The neighbor shook her head slowly, her voice steady and full of a strength that seemed to echo through the room. This is manipulation, clear as day. He isolated you from your own father so he could have more control over you. The young man's face twisted, anger replacing the fear he was barely containing. You do not know what you are talking about, but the neighbor took a step toward him, fearless, unshaken, her chin lifted with a courage that made even the guests hold their breath. Actually, I do. I have lived long enough to recognize a controlling partner when I see one. Men like you make women cut off the people who love them, so they have no one left to turn to but you. My daughter looked at him again, but this time, something in her eyes changed. The tears kept falling, but now they carried something sharper, something more awake, awareness, realization, the beginning of clarity. He noticed the shift too, and panic rushed across his face. His hand reached out and grabbed her arm, not harshly, but firmly, desperately. "Don't listen to them. They are trying to turn you against me." But she pulled her arm back, her movement slow but steady, like she was pulling herself out of a net she didn't realize she had been trapped in. And then she stepped toward me, not toward him, not toward the guests, not toward the safe, controlled, careful world he had tried to cage her in. She stepped toward me. For the first time that day, my daughter chose me, not his voice, not his rules, not his stories. And in that single step, quiet but powerful, something inside the young man cracked so loudly you could almost hear it. And that moment, fragile, beautiful, that was the beginning of his downfall. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. Every sound, every movement, every emotion hovered in the air between us, waiting for something to finally tip over. My daughter stood there, trembling, her hands shaking so badly she had to clutch them together just to steady herself. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked with tears, and her voice cracked in the quietest, most fragile way as she looked at me and whispered, "Dad, is all of this true? Have you really just been trying to help?" The softness in her voice broke something inside me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was sorrow, deep, layered, years-old sorrow. I felt my own throat tighten as I nodded slowly, almost painfully. "I never tried to control you," I said, my voice barely rising above a whisper. "I only wanted to make sure you were safe. That's all I ever wanted, and I never wanted anything from you. Not money, not favors, nothing, just to know you were okay, that you were happy." The moment the words reached her, she covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders collapsing inward like a building finally giving up after standing too long under the wrong weight. She didn't cry like adults cry, with quiet tears and controlled breaths. No, she broke the way a child breaks, when the truth hits them harder than they are ready for. Her knees wobbled, her face twisted, a choked sound escaped her throat, and suddenly the guilt poured out of her like she had been holding her breath for months, maybe years, without even realizing it. The young man saw her falling apart, and that's when the panic erupted across his face. Pure, unfiltered panic. He stepped between us too quickly, like he was afraid she would slip out of his hands the moment she truly saw me. He lifted his arms, trying to shield her from the truth that had finally cornered him. "Don't fall for this," he snapped, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound confident. "He is just trying to get sympathy. He always plays the victim, but the neighbor." She moved like a storm in human form, calm, steady, unshakably firm. She stepped closer to him, her shoulders squared, her eyes burning with a truth he couldn't escape. "No, you are the one trying to twist things. It is over. Everyone here can see what you've been doing." And they did. One by one, the guests, those same guests who were earlier pretending to mind their own business, now stood still, nodding slightly, whispering to each other, their faces filled with judgment, disappointment, even disgust. They had witnessed enough. They had heard enough. They knew exactly what kind of man he was. He felt it immediately, the way people pulled back from him, the way no one came to stand by his side, the way the house seemed to shift away from him like it was rejecting him. His eyes darted around feverishly, searching for someone, anyone who would support him, who would say, "No, you're right." But all he found was stern eyes and folded arms. My daughter took a small step back from him, then another, Each step she took away from him was like a thread snapping, one by one, breaking whatever hold he used to have over her. He reached out, his voice cracking with desperation he could no longer hide. "Please, don't do this. You need me." It was pathetic, really. A plea born not out of love, but out of fear of losing control. She shook her head, slowly, quietly, like she was finally waking up from a long dream. She didn't realize she was trapped inside. "No, I don't." Those 4 words hit him harder than anything I could have ever said. They drained the last of his confidence, stripped him of whatever power he thought he had. His shoulders fell, his face drained of color, and for the first time that day, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had built his entire sense of worth on controlling someone who finally slipped out of his hands. He looked around again, hoping, begging, silently pleading for a single ally, but no one looked back. The room was done with him. My daughter turned away from him completely and walked toward me with shaky steps, each one filled with regret, fear, and longing. When she finally stood in front of me, her voice trembled uncontrollably. "Dad, I am so sorry. I am so sorry for everything. I didn't even hesitate. I didn't need time. I didn't need explanations. I didn't need her to beg or defend herself or justify the pain. I just placed my hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently, the way I used to when she was little and scared. I forgave her right then. Not because what happened didn't hurt, not because it didn't leave scars, but because real love doesn't vanish when someone makes a mistake. Love doesn't shut the door. Love waits. Love hopes. Love forgives. And a father's love, that is the kind of love that refuses to break, no matter how hard life tries to bend it. The neighbor stepped beside us quietly, offering my daughter a small, reassuring nod. A nod that said, "You're safe now." A nod that reminded her she wasn't alone anymore. The young man watched all of us, standing in the middle of the room like a storm cloud that had finally lost its thunder. He realized in that moment that he had no more power here, no more control, no more influence. Everything he had carefully built, every lie he had planted, every manipulation he relied on it all, collapsed in seconds, and then he snapped. He stormed out of the house with an ugliness that made the door rattle on its hinges. The slam echoed through the room like the closing of a chapter that was long overdue. His pride shattered, his ego bruised, his grip gone. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the entire house had been holding itself hostage, suffocating under a pressure no one could name. But the moment he left, the very second, the door shook. Behind him, the air shifted, the tension lifted, the pressure released, and the house finally felt breathable again. When the front door finally stopped trembling from the force of his exit, the silence that followed was almost startling. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, heavy, still, but strangely cleansing. One by one, the guests began to drift away. Some left quickly, their faces burning with embarrassment because they had witnessed something intimate and painful that they had no right to judge. Others lingered at the doorway with half-hearted smiles, muttering awkward goodbyes, unsure of what to say, unsure of whose side they had silently taken by doing nothing at all. And then the house was still, just me, my daughter, the echo of what had happened, and the lingering truth that everything had changed. My daughter stood in the kitchen, wiping down a counter that was already spotless. She moved plates that did not need to be moved, rearranged spoons that were already in perfect lines, scrubbed the same corner 3 times. It was her way of avoiding the weight in the air, her way of trying to wash away the guilt sitting heavy on her shoulders. Minutes passed before she finally stopped, before she finally allowed herself to sit at the kitchen table. She lowered herself into the chair slowly, like her body was carrying the exhaustion of the entire day. She looked 10 years younger, like the little girl who used to run into my arms with scraped knees and big dreams, yet 10 years older from the emotional bruises she had allowed someone else to place on her heart. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with a truth that had taken too long to break through. "I let someone poison me against you. I should have known better. I should have trusted you." I sat down beside her, not as a wounded man, not as someone looking for an apology, but as her father, the same man who held her when she cried her first cry, the same man who taught her how to ride a bike, how to tie her shoes, how to face the world when it became too loud. I placed my hand gently on the table, close enough for her to reach if she needed it. "It's all right," I said quietly. "People fall for the wrong voices sometimes. People get confused. They get scared. They get overwhelmed. What matters is that you see clearly now." "And you do." Her lips trembled, and she slowly leaned over, resting her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was little and the world felt too big. The weight of her head, the familiar, soft pressure, was more healing than any apology could ever be. In that moment, something inside me stitched itself back together. A wound did not fully close, but it stopped bleeding. A few minutes later, the neighbor walked back into the kitchen, holding 2 cups of tea, one for me, one for my daughter. She placed them gently on the table and took a seat across from us. Her face was calm, warm, softened by empathy. "You deserved better treatment today," she said softly. "And I hope you know I spoke up because it was the right thing to do. Not out of pity, not out of anger, but because no father should ever be treated that way." I looked at her sincerely. "Thank you. I owe you more than you know." But she shook her head with a smile that held years of wisdom. "No, you owe yourself. You need to start setting boundaries. Start valuing your own worth. You've given your whole life to everyone around you. Now it's time for you to expect something in return. Respect, care, basic decency." Those words didn't just hit me, they settled inside me, like seeds that had been waiting years for the right soil. Because she was right. I had spent so long being the helper, the fixer, the giver, that somewhere along the line, I forgot to demand even the smallest ounce of respect in return. I forgot that love doesn't mean shrinking yourself, that helping doesn't mean surrendering your dignity, that being available doesn't mean allowing someone to treat you like an afterthought. Later that evening, my daughter walked me out to my truck. The sky was dark by then, painted in deep blues and soft greys, with the moon hanging low like it had been quietly watching the entire ordeal. The air was cool and still, brushing lightly against our faces. For the first time in months, maybe longer, my daughter looked at me with eyes that held warmth again. Real warmth. The kind that isn't forced or guarded or shaped by someone else's influence. When we reached the truck, she stopped and took a breath. She looked smaller, softer, human in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be around me lately. I hugged her gently, not tightly, not possessively, just enough to let her know I was still here, still her father, still the person she could come back to even after she had lost her way. "I love you," I whispered, "and I'll always be here." But listen to me. I will not let anyone treat me like I don't belong. Not anymore. She nodded firmly, tears filling her eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of guilt. They were tears of clarity, tears of realization, tears that said she finally understood the weight of everything. You won't have to, Dad, she said quietly. Not ever again. When I got in my truck and started driving home, something strange happened. The road felt lighter. The night felt gentler. The world felt a little less heavy. I rolled down the window and let the cool air hit my face. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something I didn't expect. Peace, strength, hope. Not because the day had been easy, not because the pain had disappeared, but because truth had finally cut through the lies that had been choking me for so long. Because my daughter had finally opened her eyes. Because I had finally remembered my own worth. And the lesson was clear, carved deep into the night air around me. Sometimes the people you trust the most get lost in the voices of others. Sometimes the ones you help the most forget your value. Sometimes the people you would die for treat you like you're disposable, not because they're cruel, but because someone else taught them to see you that way. And sometimes it takes an outsider, stranger, a neighbor, a single brave voice to break the spell and set things right. But once the truth comes out, it washes everything clean. This is not a story about humiliation. It is a story about waking up, about reclaiming your worth after someone tries to erase it, about standing tall in the very place they tried to push you down, and in the end, the garage, that cold, dusty place where I was told to eat like I was unworthy, and up being the room that exposed every hidden lie, every manipulation, every twisted truth. Because when people push you aside, life always finds a way to pull you back to where you belong. At the table with the people who truly love you, where your chair will always be waiting. Not in the garage, not in the shadows, not ever again.